Last summer, while I was on a trip to Biarritz, I came across a book, a French book called Monastery by someone named Eduardo Halfon in a French bookstore there. It intrigued me, the cover, actually, because it depicted an Orthodox Jewish boy in traditional garb, and I wondered, what is this image doing in a book called Monastery, this Christian dwelling? I wrote to the US publishing house, Bellevue Press, to see when he'd next be in Europe, and quickly he directly was brought into the conversation, which surprised me. And I also spoke with Alice Dion, who is here tonight from the French publishing house Taberon, and I invited him to speak to the library so that he could tell us about his writing and how he approaches fiction.
So you can sell a book by its cover. See? That photo worked. Where to begin? I guess at the beginning, you know, I was born in Guatemala a long time ago, in '71. Grew up in Guatemala in the '70s. A very difficult decade in Guatemala. But I was a child. I remember it very lovingly. And we left in '81. We fled, I say. We left, my father says. He doesn't like me saying we fled, but we fled to the States. South Florida, which was our vacation spot. So for my brothers and I, we were just going on a vacation, a longer one, but it wasn't dramatic at all. It wasn't, you know, we weren't uprooted. We just kind of left. And stayed for 12 years. So by the time I had to go back to Guatemala, I was 23, and I had almost lost my Spanish. We understood it because our parents always made an effort to speak in Spanish, but we'd answer in English, of course. So I had to go back. I was always a student. I was never a resident or a citizen. So when I finished college, engineering, I'm an engineer, by the way. I'll talk about that in a bit. I was kicked out. I couldn't stay. I didn't have a work permit. I had to go back to Guatemala. Against my will. I didn't want to. I didn't know the country. I didn't know the language. I didn't know the people. I didn't know anything. I didn't want to be there. So I left and began in Guatemala a period of extreme desubicación. There isn't an English word for that. Not being situated. In English it's difficult because I just didn't feel at home. Yeah, I didn't feel right. Linguistically, I had to, work at getting my Spanish back. Culturally, I didn't know the country anymore. I'm from a Jewish family, which doesn't help in a Catholic country. And also, as an engineer, I studied engineering by mistake, or because I didn't decide otherwise, because I couldn't decide otherwise. I didn't know what to study. So I was sort of pushed into, engineering. I liked math. I was good at math. Should have studied math. But I didn't know. I was 17 and dumb, and I was just pushed into my father's career. He's an engineer. So I'm 23. Oh, and by the way, and this is an important by the way, I never read. I didn't like books, I didn't care for books, I never looked for books, I didn't understand what all the deal was with, fiction. And thus began about 5 years in Guatemala of really just frustration. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand why I felt so bad. Now I understand that it's the 20s. Most people out of college feel a certain degree of, what do I do now? It's this moment. It's the first moment where we really have to face our future. or so we think, and that can be daunting, and it was for me. It just did not feel well. After 5 years, I went back to college. I wanted an answer, and I'm very rational. And I went back to college in Guatemala, and I wanted to enroll in a philosophy course. I guess I could have gone to a shrink, I could have gone to a rabbi, but I went to a philosopher. But in Latin America, it's a joint degree. It's called Letras y Filosofía, letters and philosophy, literature and philosophy. You can't study one without the other. So I was forced into a literature course. They said, okay, you can study philosophy if you take a lit course. And it was immediate. I immediately fell in love with books. I don't know why. Don't ask which book it was, I don't remember. Something happened right there that hadn't happened before. It was fiction. It wasn't philosophy, it wasn't, it was fiction. Something about fiction just crept in. And I fell into it. It was an accident. I fell into books. And I started reading like a madman, is the only way to say it. I started reading all I could read. I wanted to read everything I hadn't read in 28 years. So, I'd had to read Emma Bovary for a course, and in a week I'd read all of Flaubert, all of it. A book a day, a book and a half a day. I'd read all day, all night. And I'd arrive at the course, at the class, with all of these authors read. I quit. I worked part-time as an engineer in the mornings and read all afternoon. This went on for about 1.5 years. I just wanted to read. And then I quit. I had a little money and I quit and I just read for another year. I had no idea one could be a writer. I didn't think about writing, I just thought about reading. And it's sort of like a glass reading, and you fill the glass with books. And once it's full, the overfill, is the writing. And I still feel that way. The writing is what happens when the glass is full. The writing part is what happens when I'm so full of books that something comes out. The leftover, the something overfills. And that's what happened. About 2 years later, 2.5 years later, I started scribbling in Spanish. I don't know why in Spanish. I didn't know Spanish. I still didn't have my Spanish back. I still don't have my Spanish back. But for some reason, I immediately started in Spanish. Maybe it was because I was in Guatemala. If this would have happened in the States, maybe I would have started. I don't know. And started to learn the craft. What's curious about that moment, this was in 98 or 99. Yeah, 99. I came to Paris. Because all writers have to come to Paris, of course. I didn't know how to write a sentence. And I came to Paris, and I'd quit my job, so I came here for 4 months, and I had a horrible time. I got really sick. I was by myself. I didn't know what I was doing. But when I went back home, the day I got back to Guatemala, I got a phone call. And it was a teacher at the university, Ernesto Lucota, a philosopher, who offered me a job as an assistant, as his assistant. And so, in hindsight, Paris was like the wall between the engineer and the writer. It was that line that I had to cross for some reason. But what's interesting about Lucota, this teacher, is that I gave him what I'd written in Paris. A really, really bad story. I didn't know Spanish and I was writing a story. 25 pages of really poor Spanish. And he did the best thing that anybody has ever done for me. Basically, he insulted me. He read it and said, "This is absolute garbage. This is pretentious. You don't know how to use words. What are you doing trying to write a story? So much time, so much effort, you're wasting my time, and you don't know how to write." And I said, "I want to learn." So he began to teach me. He would ask me to write a line about a tree for the next day. And since we'd worked together, he'd look at the line about the tree, and we'd go over one line. And for the next day, one line about a chair, and one line about your father, and one line about a bird. And he wouldn't let me go to a second line. We spent 4 months on a daily exercise of just going over one line before he let me go to 2, and then a paragraph, and then a page. It was intense. I wanted the craft. He was a great teacher of the craft. By the way, a bad writer. He's a philosopher. When he'd give me his stories, he's not a storyteller. But as far as language, how to use a comma, how not to use an adjective, etc., he was brilliant. And a 1.5 years later, I published my first book. It was my first manuscript, written in Spanish, and it just happened very easily. Then it got complicated, the publishing part. But that first one, it was just easy. A book about suicide. And that was 12 books ago. 12 years ago, 2003. I read very small books. I read constantly. Very short, very brief. But it's almost as if I've written one book made up of all these little books. That is, there is a very strong relationship between all of my books. A connection. In some cases, very evident, as I'll show you in a second. In others, a little more implicit. But there's this idea in my head that I'm really only writing one big book. I'm just publishing it as I go along. I'm but it is one project. So, there's 2 or 3 books after that first one. The second one, obvious now to me, is called The Literary Angel. And it's a hybrid. It's part novel, part essay, part diary on why someone begins to write. I was not convinced that I should write. How did I wind up here? Me. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be a writer. I was groomed for something else. So I wrote that book. And then The Polish Boxer in 2008, which has become the title of this entire project that came after. So Grant, you want me to speak a bit about The Polish Boxer? Polish Boxer, the original Spanish version, is very short. It's 100 pages, 6 stories. One narrator, who's got my name, my beard, not my personality, I don't think. He smokes a lot. I don't. People think I do, obviously, but I don't. But he's much more intrepid. He goes places and says what I'm too timid to say. So it's one narrator and can be read as a novel. An episodic novel. 6 episodes in the life of a narrator. But in each of them, this idea of a Polish boxer creeps in. Sort of pokes its head and then goes back and hides. Until at the end of the book, there's a story called The Polish Boxer, and I tell it. And it's my grandfather's story in Auschwitz. My grandfather, Polish, from Lodz, or Łódź, as they say in Polish, was captured in '39, right at the beginning, and spent 6 years in camps, and survived. And after the war, first went to Berlin, then went to New York, and in New York he found out that a cousin in Guatemala was alive. And went to Guatemala. Who's alive? And so he showed up. And never spoke about what happened. He spent the next 60 years not speaking about what happened in the camps. So he had his tattoo, and his children in the 70s, we'd ask about the tattoo, and he'd say, it's my phone number. I tattooed my phone number in case I forget it. And that image, the image of a child, yeah, the child's eye view of a grandfather's tattoo and joke is like a tattoo for me. I remember that. I remember the feeling I had looking at it, or staring at it, and asking him, and him not wanting to talk about it. And finally, in '99, he talked to me. For some reason, he decided to tell me what happened. And he took out a bottle of whiskey and spoke for 6 hours. Very calm, very chaotic. You know? He didn't remember anymore what came first. I was here, no, I was there. There's a lot of dust after 60 years. And in those 6 hours, suddenly, he told me a little small anecdote about a boxer. No more than 2 minutes. And I knew immediately that that was his story. That was the story that I had to tell. I knew immediately. As he was saying this, as he was telling me this, I knew it. And I took it out of the 6 hours and tucked it in my pocket. And there it stayed for 8 years. It took me 8 years to find the courage, maybe, to find a way to tell it, to find a way to honor him. I didn't want to, dishonor him. To find a way to, into such a huge subject. I don't know, it took 8 years. But everything I wrote during those 8 years, I'd mention it. And everything I wrote, it's in my books, it's in these first 5 stories. It would come out and go back in. So it became sort of like a thread, yeah, that went through all I wrote. Until finally, I found a window. I found a way in and wrote the story. The French edition of that book, which just came out 2 weeks ago, is more or less just that story. Yeah, it's a short book, 50 pages, with some photos. The only photos of my grandfather that he kept is in Berlin. And which is also, by the way, is a diptych with, this is my new book. It's called Eduardo Halfon, and it came out first in French. It'll come out in Spanish in September. So it came out first in French. It's one photo. Mm-hmm. Yeah? It's the only photo of his family that he kept. All dead. Except for him. This is my grandfather. So, Polish Boxer. Publish it, 2008, 6 stories. 2 years later, 2010, one of those stories becomes a chapter in my next book. I rewrite it, and it's the first chapter of a book called The Pirouette. Okay? It gets a little complicated here, but I'm going to try to do this as orderly as I can. 2 years later, no, sorry, 4 years later, 2014, another of those stories, of those original 6, becomes a chapter in another short novel called Monastery. So the Polish Boxer, the original version, the book, starts giving birth to other books. Okay? Fragments of this one book then become stories. One is a trip to Belgrade, to Serbia. That's the pirouette. And Monastery is a trip to Israel. Okay? Never planned it. All of this started to happen spontaneously in front of me. No engineering in the process. There's an engineering now in putting all this together, but not while I write. The stories started to grow in front of me. Okay? So there's 4 books. Polish Boxer, Pirouette, Monastery, and now Sr. Halfon, which is also part of this same project. Same narrator, same guy, going on all these trips everywhere. Same voice, same quest, and deep down, he's looking for something, I don't know what, but he's looking for something. So it's perfectly feasible to publish them together as one big book, as the Japanese are doing this year. The Germans, the German translation, they decided to do 2 books. So instead of 4 small books, they're doing 2 medium-sized books. The Polish Boxer in German includes the pirouette, and Monastery in German includes Sr. Halfon. The US versions are exactly the same as the Germans. I think you have them here, right? So, why does this work? It's a mess. It's a mess because each edition is not only different in its format, I also rearrange the stories to give that reader a sense of unity and a trip. But I also edit the stories themselves. Because there's several things, or there's things or aspects or details that I need to take away or add, depending on where that story is in the table of contents. I see it as follows. I only write stories. Yeah? Short stories. And I place them all on the table. And then with each editor, we stare at these stories and say, okay, how do you want to do this for your country? How do you want to format this? So I'll take these stories and put them here, and I'll take these stories and put them. Stories that are all independent, but linked. Okay? Complicated, but fascinating. I love this. I love that it's happening. I love that my relationship with each publisher has to be a sort of marriage, because we're working on a project. We're not working on a book. We're working on an idea of books, and we're headed somewhere. Nobody knows where. I don't know where. I don't know what book is coming next. They'd love to know. I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to write next. So with each publisher, Spain, Japan, Germany, Italy, France, the US, we have to work together and present my project, for lack of a better word, to their readers. It's their readers they have in mind. The French readers, the US readers, the Italian, very different readers in each country. It's not the same. US readers want a big book. They don't want 50-page, beautiful, small books. In France, this is perfect. So it's not only a question of literary decisions, but also the readers. Yeah? Complicated? No, easy. And that's where we're at. My new book comes out in Spain later this year. And that's it. I'd love if you guys had questions. It makes my job a lot easier than just monologuing. That's part of the reason why he survived. He was in working age. He was 18. He was 18 when he was captured. So probably 20 when he went to Auschwitz. You know, strong young guy. He would always say it was luck. You know, he would say two things: luck and God is big. That was his. Dios es grande, he would say. So a lot of this, you know, it could have been me. You know, he told me a lot of stories of we were standing in line and they would just shoot randomly, and they didn't shoot me for some reason, and they shot the two guys next to me. So it was a lot of that stuff. But when he finally talked, he was in his 80s. He was in his 80s already, and he died. When did he die? 2010. Yeah, 2009. I was not in Nebraska yet. 2009. And he had a very poor ending to his life. He the last 5 months, he couldn't sleep. There wasn't a pill strong enough, so he'd spend 4, 5, 6 days awake. Started hallucinating. He thought there were German officers in his room. He'd yell at them. He'd say, "They're waiting for me, they're taking me, now they're taking me." So once he opened up to me, for the following 8 years, he couldn't stop talking about it. Or thinking about it probably, or dreaming about it. I mean, he just opened up a well of nasty, you know, memories. But he was 18. You know? His brother was 14, didn't survive, he died of hunger. And his sisters died in the ghetto, in Lodz. So age, I think, had a lot to do with it. And strength, physical strength. It depended. I still, to this day, will look for an English translation before a Spanish. Yeah? So if I have to read a Russian writer or a French writer, I will try to look for an English. I prefer to read in English. And I also know now, from experience, that Spanish translators generally are not the best. Yeah? It's one of the poorest salaries I've seen. Publishers try to spend less on translation in Spain, so they hire, you know, generally, not always. So I would look for English, except for Latin American writers, of course. Native. But what's interesting is that I arrived to all my fellow Latin American afterwards. So I read the Americans before I read the Latin Americans. Hemingway and Carver and Cheever are much more present in my writing than Borges or Garcia Marquez or Cortázar. They're there, and I got to them, but I got to them after. Yeah, I feel much more empathy. I feel much more akin to the North American story writer. When I'm writing, I'm thinking in English. I didn't mention that. That's kind of important, isn't it? I still, to this day, now it's a little of both, but when I started writing 15 years ago, or 12 years ago, or whatever, I was thinking predominantly in English. And I had to make that fit into Spanish.
But there are different languages. I mean, it's difficult to be influenced by English and writing in Spanish.
No, it's difficult. I'll tell you what's difficult. Convincing an editor that it's okay. Yeah? Because the first line of defense, editors, publishers, magazines, whatever, will try to fix my Spanish. No, you don't do that. You're using too many adverbs, which is not good in Spanish. It's frowned upon. And I understand why. They're heavier. In English, they're softer. Yeah? Or the syntaxes, or the placement of the adjective. There's small things that I carry over from English, still. And I was speaking about this last week. At first, there was such resistance, you know, of people protecting Spanish, and you can't do that. No, let's fix this. But once I got past that, once I was able to defeat that first line of defense, then what happens is the most beautiful thing, because I developed my own private Spanish. My narrator has my name. I mean, if you start from there, is this fiction? It says fiction on the cover, so it's a game I'm playing, you know, which I like to play. I want to lull the reader into something by doing this. I always start from reality. This is the only way I can explain this. I always start from something very factual. A trip, an image, you know, a tattoo, etc. Every story I write begins with an image, very close to me. But that's not enough. Because what I want to give you as a reader is not an image, but a feeling, an emotion. And the only way I know how to do that is through fiction. So what interests me, to say it with less clarity, is not reality, but truth. I'm not interested in reality. I'm interested in truth. Truth not as a thing. I don't have the truth. I don't know the truth. But as a feeling. And Herzog, the filmmaker, called this ecstatic truth. So an ecstasies of truth, an emotional historia secreta, we say in Spanish. So the secret story, you know, that is there, but it's not physically there. That's the truth I want. That's the essence, if you prefer. Yeah, maybe that's a better word. The essence of the story. That is there, but so ethereal that it's barely palpable, but it's there. If at some point, and this will happen to you, I promise, you start reading The Polish Boxer. You bought it as a story. We signed a contract. Yeah? As fiction. At some point, readers forget that contract and start reading it as absolute truth. This guy had a grandfather that this happened to. Oh my God. And then the emotion that I want the reader to feel is that much stronger, because they start reading as children. Children don't doubt if it's true. It's just true. That's it. Yeah? That's what I want. So this game of blurring the line has an intentionality. Yeah. 69752. That it was his phone number. That he had it tattooed there on his left forearm so he wouldn't forget it. That's what my grandfather told me. And that's what I grew up believing. In the 1970s, telephone numbers in Guatemala were 5 digits long. I called him Oitse because he called me Oitse, which means something soppy in Yiddish. I liked his Polish accent. I liked dipping my pinky in his glass of whiskey. I liked asking him to draw me pictures. But he only actually knew how to draw one picture, quickly sketched, always identical, of a sinuous and disfigured hat. I liked the beet red color of his sauce, chrein in Yiddish, that he poured over his white bowl of fish, gefilte fish in Yiddish. I liked going with him on his walks around the neighborhood, the same neighborhood where one night, in the middle of a big vacant lot, a plane full of cows had crashed. But most of all, I liked that number, his number. It didn't take me long, however, to understand his telephone joke and the psychological importance of that joke, and eventually, although nobody would admit it, the historical origin of that number. Then, when we went on walks together, or he started drawing a series of hats, I would stare at those 5 digits, and strangely happy, play a game of inventing secret scenes of how he might have gotten them. Like this. My grandfather face up on a hospital bed, while straddling him, an enormous German officer dressed in black leather, shouted out the numbers one at a time to an anemic-looking nurse, also dressed in black leather, who then handed him, one by one, hot irons. Or this: my grandfather sitting on a wooden bench in front of a semicircle of Germans in white coats and white gloves, with white lights fastened around their heads like miners, when suddenly one of the Germans stammered out a number and a clown rode in on a unicycle, and all the lights shone their white light on my grandfather, while the clown, with a big green marker in ink that could never be erased, wrote that number on his forearm, and all the German scientists applauded. Or this: my grandfather standing at the ticket booth of a cinema, sticking his left arm in through the little round opening in the glass where they pass you the tickets, and on the other side of the window, a fat, hairy German woman setting the 5 digits on one of those stamps with adjustable dates, like they use in banks, and then, as if it was an extremely important date, stamping it hard and forever onto my grandfather's forearm. That's how I played with his number, clandestinely, hypnotized by those 5 mysterious green digits that, much more than on his forearm, seemed to be tattooed on some part of his soul. Green and mysterious until not so long ago. In the late afternoon, sitting on his old butter-colored sofa, I was drinking whiskey with my grandfather. I noticed that the green wasn't as green as it used to be, but more of a diluted pale grayish color that made me think of something decomposing. The 7 had almost amalgamated with the 5. The 6 and the 9, unrecognizable, were now 2 swollen blobs, deformed and out of focus. The 2, in full flight, gave the impression of having moved a few millimeters away from the rest of them. I looked at my grandfather's face and suddenly realized that in my childhood game, in each of my boyish fantasies, I had imagined him already old, already a grandfather, as if he'd been born a grandfather, or as if he'd aged once and for all at the very moment of receiving that number, which I now examined so meticulously. It was in Auschwitz. At first I wasn't sure I'd heard him. I looked up. He was covering the number with his right hand. Drizzle purred against the roof tiles. "This," he said, rubbing his forearm gently. "It was in Auschwitz," he said. "It was with the Boxer," he said, without looking at me and with no emotion whatsoever, and speaking in an accent no longer his own. Huh?
Wow.
So the key, la clé, that took me 8 years, and which some of you will read if you read the rest of this, and which you know, is that I wasn't writing about my grandfather. That is, I wasn't writing about a grandfather. I was writing about a grandson. It took me 8 years to finally figure that out. And once I had that, the story wrote itself. It's what happens to a grandson at the moment when he receives his inheritance, his heritage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.